Okay, so welcome to our July BioWednesday webinar, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're located. I'm delighted to have the range of panelists that we do on this session to give insights into today's topic. So we're going to be looking at the issue of contact sports injuries, what can be done to reduce the risks, progress in treatments, and a look into longer term effects, but also the appetite for investment in a post-pandemic world and sort of what effect that's having on sort of the interest in our sector and where investments are going. So just a few words from me before we begin. So it is quite a unique topic, mainly because it affects such a wide number of people and not only our sector. So, you know, the emphasis at the moment in a post-pandemic world is sort of on health and safety. So I guess you could say that sports are sort of, you know, they shed a light on that and very relevant because of that, and the emphasis for us all to sort of be the best that we can. So it will be exciting to hear the insights from our panel into, you know, our understanding of how we can treat these injuries, monitor them better, reduce risks, and then also, as I mentioned, the investment angle as well. So if you're not on the panel, if you can kindly remain muted with cameras off, if that's okay. And if you do have any questions, then please utilize the chat box, and I will pick those up throughout the session, and I will pass those to our chair, Mike Ward. So we are scheduled in for an hour, so you don't have to wait. If you do have any thoughts or comments or questions, just drop those into the chat box and we'll find an appropriate time in the session to take those to the panel. And just to highlight, we are recording the session so that it can be available as part of the One Nucleus on-demand content. So with that, I'm going to disappear into the background and hand to our moderator, Mike Ward. Over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Alicia, and hello and welcome to this BioWebinar, BioWednesday webinar. BioWebinar, well, maybe that should be a new title. We're all familiar with how fragile investor confidence can be, especially in areas where it's potentially sort of high risk. Yet high risk or high impact events such as scientific breakthroughs or an immediate and critical unmet needs such as that we saw last year with COVID-19 can certainly sometimes bring sort of a focus to areas that may have been a little neglected. And similarly, we've sort of seen in sort of the neuroscience space over recent years, we've seen quite a lot of the major pharmaceutical companies actually retreat from the sector, and yet we're completely aware of the unmet medical needs. So, given the fact that the Euros, and I feel very sorry for anybody who isn't Italian, but the Euros have just been completed, and the British and the Irish Lions tours in South Africa has just got underway, and the Tour de France is on. All these are big contact sports, and yet we're also trying to encourage young people, or not so young, to engage in physical activity. So we thought we'd look at the issue that has recently gained quite a lot of attention in the general press, and that is around the sort of potential long-term effects of sports-related concussion, especially associated with those contact sports, and whether there actually is an appetite among investors to back potential treatments for those sort of conditions. So to discuss this and related issues, we have a panel, and I'm going to read out their names in alphabetical order. So we have Eva Haas, who's a senior consultant with for healthcare at Optimum Strategic Communications. We've got Hugh Nuttall, senior director of search and evaluation at Eli Lilly. Claire Thompson, who's the CEO of Agility Life Sciences. William Walker Arnott, senior investment manager at Charles Stanley, and Michael Wyand, who's the CEO of Oxyare Biopharmaceuticals. So first, I would like to ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves and the sort of the companies or the activities that they represent, and maybe also share an initial thought about the insights that they hope to bring to this discussion, on the challenges of investing and or developing treatments for conditions that could be possibly avoided if we were a little more risk averse. So again, we'll go in alphabetical order. So we can start with Eva, then Hugh, Claire, Will, and Michael. Yeah. So.
Okay, I'll take it away. So I'm Eva Haas. I work at Optimum Strategic Comms. We work with doing investor relations and comms for healthcare companies. We're focused on life sciences. We work with big listed companies and all the way down to small private companies. We work a lot with small private biotech companies, and we also work with the venture investors that invest in them and have pretty good connections there. My personal history prior to that was that I was a healthcare equity analyst at a big investment house in the city, Schroders, for about 20 years. Half of that I spent in the US covering US healthcare. So I guess I'm bringing a bit of a comms and kind of investor hat to things, particularly from the buy side, I suppose, as well. And what I hope to add is show you that finance people can sometimes talk sense and maybe a little bit more intelligent than some people think.
So, Hugh.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I work at, as you said, at Eli Lilly and Company. I've background as a PhD scientist, cellular molecular biologist, worked in some different aspects of neuroscience for about 20 plus years now. At Lilly, I work in the neurodegeneration therapeutic area as a senior director for Search and Evaluate. So I lead the scientific and technical evaluations of external opportunities. These could be partnerships, collaborations that span early target ID discovery, work with academia and biotech through licensing of individual assets at different stages of development to involvement in M&As as well. So what I was hoping to bring to today's discussion was some maybe some parallels and potential learning opportunities from approaches that we and many others have been taking for chronic neurodegenerative diseases that we're maybe more familiar with, such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and others, and maybe how that could inform some of the thinking around the discovery and development processes for the topic for today's discussion.
All right. So, Claire.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Claire Thompson. I'm Chief Exec of Agility Life Sciences. We are an award-winning CDMO consulting and communications company. So we work with clients from tiny spin-outs all the way up to multinationals in 3 key areas. So the first one is in the science. We help them to turn their ideas into therapeutic products, get those products into the clinic and onto the market as fast as possible. The second piece, as this panel will quite rightly know, there's no point in having a great idea if you can't get any money behind it. So we work with them on their strategy. What's the gap in the market? What's the market for the gap? And how can you convince either your internal stakeholders or external individuals to put their hand in their pocket and believe in you and fund it? And the last piece, which underpins everything that we do, is helping our clients to tell their story. It's so important in this day and age now that the eyes of the world is upon us as a life science industry to convey our message in as simple and impactful way as possible. And in terms of what I would like to bring to this, I'm a scientist, a strategist, and a storyteller, but I'm also a sportswoman. So I was a footballer for many, many years. I have the war wounds to show for it. And I don't have a left knee and a right knee. I have a good knee and a bad knee. And I want to kind of think about this from a drug discovery perspective. So a number of our clients are working on dementia and Alzheimer's. So we understand the need for this, but also thinking about the patient side and the importance of activity and sport in terms of physical and mental well-being, especially for girls.
So, Will.
Yeah, hi. Afternoon, everyone. My name's Will Walker-Arnott. I'm a senior investment manager at a company called Charles Stanley. So I'm very much a generalist investor. Charles Stanley is one of the largest wealth management companies in the UK. We currently look after about 25 billion. We do invest in the life sciences and biotech arena. So hopefully I can give you some insight into what we're looking for potential investments. The other side to the coin, and what I can bring today, is that we are actually also one of the major corporate sponsors of Harlequins Rugby Club, who've been recently made champions of the UK, Premiership champions. And so I've been talking to them, and I can give you some of their insights into the area as well. So they're the two areas I can contribute today.
Great, thanks very much. I'm a Saracens fan, so but we'll be back next season. And finally, Michael, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
That's mistake number one here for the whole hour. I'm Michael Wyan, CEO of Oxy Biopharma. We are developing a pharmaceutical therapy for concussion, for mild traumatic brain injury. The molecule that we're working with has some very interesting properties in energy homeostasis, mitochondria increases, and connectivity in the brain. So it covers a lot of the spectrum of injury that we see with traumatic injuries, especially the mild traumatic brain injuries. It also has applications across a broader range of neurodegenerative conditions, including those in which there's cognitive decline, cognitive issues, and degeneration. So we can start to think about things like some of the chemotherapy-induced cognitive issues that occur with long-term chemotherapy. And recently, in the COVID pandemic, we're aware now that there are neurologic complications that also lead to cognitive declines. So there are a lot of connections between the traumatic type of degeneration and other types of degeneration. My background is I'm a pathologist who has been in the biotech industry, mostly in the Boston, Massachusetts area for the past 30, 35 years. Worked across a number of different indications and clinical disease areas. I have to say this is one of the more exciting ones that I've been in because of just the kind of early stages we're in pharmaceutical development. Certainly this injury in sports and this injury just in population has been around as long as man's been around. But we're just getting started, really, I would say, in understanding its severity, as well as developing effective treatments or protective gear or diagnostic tests to be able to deal with it. And a lot of the, as we see it, a lot of the things that need to be clarified for the technology and the investors to kind of come together is just that issue about its very early stage. Very few drugs no drugs have gone through our regulatory body, the FDA. So there's questions about variability in the patient population and what the appropriate endpoints are. So happy to be on the panel. It should be exciting. We've got a good diverse group, and I look forward to discussion.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Michael. In fact, I think it would be useful for the audience if we kicked off the discussion, if you could sort of remind us of the sort of the evidence base associated with, for example, long-term effects of a sports-related concussion, and a little bit more sort of granular on sort of how that evidence base is sort of I guess shaping or underpinning your approach.
Yeah, I would say it's very interesting. Despite how important we all recognize our brains are, we really, if you think back to, I think back to when I played sports, if I got whacked in the head and didn't quite know where I was, couldn't hardly stand up, but I could stagger back onto the field, everybody's clapping and you're a hero, and the coach is encouraging you, your teammates are encouraging you, and you might not know where you are for 4 or 5 plays, then you might start to get engaged. If I twisted my knee and got carted off to go to the hospital and get an x-ray taken, everybody understood that. Oh yeah, oh, he's injured his knee. That's really important. He needs his legs to walk. So that has to be addressed. And so there was no question about your commitment to the game or your toughness if you were taken off with a knee injury, which is kind of a very crazy position to be in, since we all know how important our brains are. We can discuss why that is. Some of that has to do probably with the fact that the brain is so encased within our skulls that it's really not something that we can see or touch or feel. So it's a little bit, it's out of sight, out of mind in a way. But nonetheless, that that situation has gotten us to the point where when we started to observe that there were long-term effects and even short-term effects related to this injury, it took a while, and it's still taking a while for people to get their heads around it. And so right now, we're in the kind of phase where there's a lot of scientific debate about what's going on, what are the different types of the injuries. And as we'll probably discuss, there's the immediate effects of the injury where a person is affected immediately. And then there's what I'll call the subacute or the post-concussion effects, where those effects might linger and might have dramatic effects on how a person can go to school, how can they have relationships. And then, of course, over the years, and we work very closely with the Concussion Legacy Foundation here in Boston, now we start to recognize that not only does this occur in a post-concussive situation months to years after the injury, but many, many years after the injury. And now this syndrome called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, exists, in which there's some very severe changes that we can only identify after death. And those changes do look like they're related to these earlier brain traumas and perhaps even subconcussive injury. And that's one of the questions I think that needs to be addressed is, what's the role of subconcussive injury versus a diagnosable injury such as concussion? So we're starting to figure that out. And what that means for the investment community, whenever they hear that there's questions about what's going on, there's questions about how the disease is segregated, there's questions about how the regulatory bodies respond to them. Whenever that happens, investors are frequently very, very careful when they tread into the space. And so that's what we found out as we've raised money. Oxia right now has started its first phase 2 trial at the University of Kansas in Kansas City. And so we're starting our, a real clinical program where we'll start to get some answers as we go through the program.
Yeah, great. I mean, so some interesting points there, and I think that we shall through the discussion sort of come back to some of them. Hugh, I mean, sort of looking at the neuroscience space, one of the challenges around sort of diagnosis. I mean, for example, the American Psychiatric Association, right, in its 5th edition of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it actually eliminated the diagnosis of post-concussion syndrome because there was sort of they weren't necessarily convinced of what was going there. When you've got, and this happens in other sort of neuroscience spaces as well, when you have that sort of the questioning around the sort of the diagnosis or potential clinical utility, how does that impact the way that sort of a big pharma and its appetite for accessing sort of assets that would for example focus on the long-term impact of sport-related injuries?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, Mike, and I think it certainly does highlight the challenges for pharma and others, and how they, whether or not they're going to invest in this area. And it's pretty clear, I think, if you look at the public-facing websites, look at the disease areas of focus for the big biopharma companies. I don't think any of them clearly state that TBI or CTE they're not specifically mentioned. But I think through in conversations with colleagues and at meetings with people from other organizations, there's certainly many neurologists, scientists within these companies that have a real interest in this area. Maybe they've worked like Michael in this perhaps in the past, or maybe they still see patients through clinical practice. So I think there's a clear interest. There's obviously a clear unmet medical need. And I think from our and other perspective, I think the interest is around some of the overlaps with the more chronic neurodegenerative diseases, as Michael's alluded to, where there's maybe overlapping pathologies at the end of the disease. So I think thinking about that, there is a clear disease here that will eventually manifest. What I think is needed, I suppose, is to build an infrastructure, I suppose, around a few key areas to maybe generate a willingness to work in this area. So I think there's understanding better the etiology of the disease. How does the repeat concussions and other mild injuries lead to a chronic disease state? How do you track that with biomarkers for prognosis and diagnosis? And then how do you actually design trials, select patients, and know when to intervene with different treatments to assess, and how do you assess the effects? So I think maybe thinking about those few areas a little bit more, understanding the etiology. In many other disease states, there's been a lot of genetic work around how does genetics and indeed how do other risk factors affect the course of disease for individuals. Maybe that's an area that could be expanded for this, together with maybe increased pathological understanding. Michael said he worked as a pathologist. I think having more access to brains of individuals to look at what actually changes in there at the end of the disease. These can all be used then to kind of generate more hypotheses about pathways, mechanisms that could be modulated. Then I think what needs to go with that is probably some animal model work. I don't think there's a lot of complex animal models that can mimic what happens in the human. So that's probably an area that needs more investment. Again, to test mechanisms, identify targets, and work out what potential doses you would need to use. The biomarker section, I think, again, say AD as an example, there's been huge investment in both imaging and fluid biomarkers to look at what occurs over time. So maybe tracking changes after repeat concussions or repeat injuries. These again could be used to help inform hypotheses, also to track changes in individuals over time. Those could even be used to limit involvement in sports, perhaps, if markers go above or below certain levels. Then I think, yes, that around the clinical trial design, within the AD and other dementia space, there's been huge work in innovative trial design, but also in understanding the rating scales, so cognitive and other behavioral measures that are perhaps specific to this disease state and are potentially sensitive to changes for therapies in this disease versus others. And I think combining all those together and building that infrastructure, I think over time will potentially bring in more interest from some of the larger organizations into this area.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Will, I mean, you in your introduction, you point out that you're a generalist investor. So when you hear Hugh, so talking about all those known unknowns associated, with this space, how do you, as a generalist investor, sort of weigh up, sort of the risks associated with potentially sort of financially backing, some of these opportunities? What would you want to see to be, feel comfortable about actually sort of, moving into, the space, for example, targeting sports-related concussion?
Yeah, it's the first thing we're looking for, really. I mean, I should caveat this by saying that because we're looking after private clients, we are later stage investors. So we're slightly different to your VC companies, your private equity companies who probably go in earlier stage and take more risk. So I'll just caveat by saying that. But what we are looking for is a clear route to commercialization. And from what the discussions we've had already is there is so much uncertainty, and this is me speaking as a layman, there's so much uncertainty around the brain and brain injuries. You only have to look at sort of areas like depression as well, where it seems to me as a layman that we've come to some of the treatments through luck rather than expertise. So there is a bit of skepticism in that area. But a couple of areas which do interest me, which might be worth touching on, is we do invest in the US company Abbott, which obviously has a large diagnostic division, and they had FDA approval in January 2021, earlier this year, for a handheld blood test, which can look at the whether the subject has suffered from concussion, and it does that by measuring proteins in the bloodstream after TBI. And that's now obviously FDA approved, so that's quite interesting. I mean, that's a diagnostic, obviously, seems to me less risky for someone like me to put money into, and has a much clearer route to commercialization. It helps doctors rule out the need to go for a CT scan, and it's just something which really did intrigue me when that came up. Another thing which I sort of mentioned earlier was we do work closely with Harlequins, which is a Premiership rugby club. One of the things they've been using, and this is more med tech, so medical technology, is they've been inserting sensors into the gum shields of all their players, using a technology called Protect, which is run by a Welsh company called SWA. And what that will do is give them real-time data on the sort of size of collisions, and the impact going through a match, and that's automatically fed to computers, and they can keep an eye on it. So that kind of technology is very interesting to me, and for me as a later stage investor, I think has a clearer route to commercialization rather than some of the more complex treatments. So there are a couple of areas which have intrigued me. I should say though, just looking at the biotech life science sphere as a whole, I do detect that there is, in the UK, traditionally, we've been very conservative about how we invest. It's particularly in listed companies. And we've sort of crowded around much safer areas like medical devices, maybe non-human companies like sort of Decra, where there aren't many generic competitors. And also going into sort of investments, collective vehicles like Syncona, where you're taking a whole range of risk rather than focus on one particular company. But I detect a mood change since COVID 2020. We've had a record year over the last year in terms of capital raisings on the UK market. The biotech listed sphere in the UK continues to outperform the wider FTSE All-Share. And people are beginning to take a little bit more risk, focusing on maybe cell and gene therapy companies like Oxford Biomedica, looking at small molecule companies like Synergen. And I just detect, I'm sure the other panelists also have a view, I detect a slight mood change. The UK has traditionally been very conservative when looking at these areas, but I think maybe that there may be a mood change in the aftermath of COVID. People look at companies like Moderna in the UK and are kicking themselves that they didn't take more risk at the time. And so I feel that there may be a mood change in the UK investment sphere.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Eva or Claire, whether, sort of, I mean, even with your sort of your analyst background, but also just in terms of the sort of the challenges about communicating value. Do you have any sort of your thoughts on sort of the risk appetite?
I think the risk appetite has definitely improved sort of within this, with the sort of pandemic backdrop. Hopefully we're moving to endemic shortly. I think that's kind of, particularly in areas where investors are more averse to risk, going to be driven by things like socially responsible investing in ESG, which is, has already been on the rise somewhat. It's not terribly well organized yet, and everyone does it their own way and nobody measures it consistently, but the intent is there. I think at the moment, private investors or retail investors and family offices or high net worth individuals do that kind of investment better. Probably somebody's going to kill me from some of my friends who used to work at some of the big investment houses, but I think they do it better than the big fund management companies. I'm sure that will change. I read a stat the other day that, something like there's been a 50% rise in the number of ESG open sort of job opportunities in the city in the very recent period. And that's just going to get bigger. If I put my sort of healthcare specialist hat on, the big problem in terms of valuation and people's risk aversion is that when you have something like this, it's such a big sort of blue sky potential opportunity that it's very difficult to put a number on, particularly since all of the things that Hugh detailed are kind of missing. We don't understand the biology well enough yet. It's coming, which is exciting. So it's interesting. I'd go straight for the jugular if I was talking to a company and ask about safety data, just because something like this, much like Alzheimer's drugs, could end up getting used multiple times with hundreds of millions of people. So that would be kind of, from a hardcore commercial point of view, my biggest concern if I don't know enough about the biology of what the company's actually working on beyond what they tell me. I'd love to see, new animal models. I guess rising numbers of patent applications and scientific papers in the fields are always a sign of innovation coming down the road. And then I'd want companies to show me that they are already, working with regulators to nail down pathways for therapy development, whether that's, again, animal models, outcomes measurements, acceptable size of clinical trials, given that I would be wanting to see something that's highly safe, and demonstrating an understanding of end markets, collaboration with KOLs, charities. I think Oxea, excuse me for massacring the name of your company, Michael, it's probably a poster child for that already. Having looked at your website, having sponsorship or endorsement or even board members who are sort of, high profile sports people, and then leveraging that to link into all of the other areas that, you see concussion in, because it isn't just sport. I know we're talking about sport now, and that's probably the best opportunity for making noise and generating money. But we can then use that from a societal point of view to expand it. So yeah, that's kind of where I'd be coming from.
Yeah, so
it's always difficult to invest in.
Yeah, but I mean, so it's interesting. So what, if I'm correct, so one of the sort of the recommendations is actually bring in sort of high profile celebrities to kind of like highlight the sort of both the challenge and also the sort of the potential benefits. I mean,
because they're high net worth individuals.
Yeah, I was just thinking, wearing your strategic comms hat. I mean, are there any other sort of like specific tips where companies need what they need to say to for example get Charles or any Charles Stanley or any of those other organizations to open their wallets?
I guess to some extent, like I said, at the moment, I think anything where there's a societal component, it's particularly where it's difficult to value. It's much easier to get private investors and high net worth individuals involved. So I would not exclusively focus on those. I would say that those are the sort of lowest hanging fruit. So to get Charles involved is kind of like, it's in his business. It's how do I put it? He's going to be in charge of the portfolio risk diversification. So to some extent, the more people we get outreach to that are investors, the better, and then they can do the risk diversification themselves. So I guess you can't underestimate for small companies, even at the seed stage, where some of them might have a reason to be cloaked or under the radar because of IP issues or whatever. But you can't underestimate starting early with like media outreach and getting yourself associated with topics that are important, are becoming higher profile, working with charities, and just generally helping raise the profile of something like this.
Right. So,
I mean, Mike, I can come in on this from and just following on from Eva's points and from William's point, the fact that there are rugby clubs and rugby union as a whole that are very interested in this. Certainly, you know, my background's in football, and we've seen in the Euros the amount of time that is dedicated where there is now a head injury, the effects that this can have on players, and how serious this has been taken within the sport. There's also, I mean, one of the participants has asked a question about NFL and boxing, etc. I think Eva raises a great point about having those advocates and having those critical alliances with the likes of the NFL or boxing organizations or promoters, because it's very, very visible. You know, the much larger market here from a patient perspective is around dementia, is around Parkinson's, and in fact, concussion, perhaps giving the pharma analogy, could almost be seen as a rare disease. But the fact that you have major players and major associations and individuals who are either high net worth or those organizations have a lot of money involved in that, the alliances that you can have with those and the voice that they have means an awful lot. And certainly from just to loop back to your question around what we're seeing in terms of investment and buoyancy in the life science space. Yes, we're coming out of COVID quite well, although we're not actually physically coming out of COVID. The pandemic, I think, has shone a light on the industry, showed what we can do when we're under pressure. Now, I think that puts more pressure upon us. But what we're seeing in terms of cutting through the COVID noise, what has really shone out from a communications perspective are people and purpose rather than products and profits. Now, of course, investors, whether it's VCs or corporates or private equity, they're always going to be thinking about, right, when am I going to get my return on investment? So what's the pathway to market? And when am I going to see that back, and what's my X return? But what we are seeing is that there is a focus on what's the purpose of this, what's the impact that it's going to have on people, and also the people that are involved in this. So looping that back to the comms perspective, if you are aligned with those who are very visible or organizations that have deep pockets or can hold the ear or can raise an eyebrow to your potential investors, that is always going to be good.
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned that you were, a footballer, but an international footballer. We should remind the audience. So, clearly, an accomplished sports person. You're very much involved, also, though, coaching young kids, and with the fact that these sports-related concussions, these high-profile individuals. It's kind of like raising the profile of the challenge. What as a coach of young people do you do to mitigate the risk of them potentially getting one of these, but also reassuring their parents? I mean, I remember when I watched my son playing rugby. Once they got to that age of 14, where all of a sudden it got really, really dangerous, you kind of like held your breath. So as a sort of just wearing your coach's hat, what can coaches of young people do?
I think it's really about awareness, and there's a lot more has come into the sport. And I have to say that football's much more of a lower body impact sport than it is an upper body impact sport. So there's much higher risk in the likes of American football, rugby, boxing, etc. But that doesn't mean that the risk isn't there for football. But I think it's very visible, certainly from the Euros, and it will be going on throughout men's sport and women's football, that there is a focus on, if a player goes down with a head injury, then it needs to be taken seriously. And I think there's an education piece here from a referee's perspective that filters down into grassroots sport, but also from a personal and a parent perspective. I'm a parent, we're always worried about our kids, and everything we do is about assessing the risk. But it's weighing those risks up against what the benefit is of playing sport. We can't and we shouldn't mollycoddle our children and wrap them in cotton wool. Sport is exceptionally good for kids. And I said at the start that we should be making parents and kids aware of what the risk of this is, but we should be encouraging people to continue playing sport. From a from an active participation and also a mental health perspective, we should be encouraging them to do so. And also from the, I mean, all of the skills that I use in business now, I've learned from sport. So it's about skills for life and leadership, not just skills for sport. And these are the things that we should be embracing and encouraging, but also, you've got to be aware of the risk and how to diagnose the injuries. And I think my fellow panelists here have talked at length about the importance of having those diagnostic markers, not just for diagnosing the injury at the start, whether it is subconcussion or actual concussion, but monitoring the progression of the disease and where that maps to. Is it Parkinson's? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it dementia? Is it personality disorders? We've seen the high-profile case of Aaron Hernandez in the States. Very young kid, very prolific player. It seemed to change his mental well-being. It looks like he got involved in a few murders. It was an incredible case, but these are the things that we need to look at, and there are opportunities here to work with high-profile organizations and align them with what we're doing within life sciences for the good of the kids that are playing sport.
And Mike, I was just going to touch on rugby quickly because I'm a keen rugby fan, and there's quite an important moment when an England World Cup winner called Steve Thompson, who won the World Cup in 2003, came out recently and said he doesn't even remember winning the World Cup. He was a front row forward who suffered repetitive brain injuries, he thinks, whilst playing for England. He's now going to take a class action against the RFU, I think, for not looking after him during that period of time. And I think the RFU are taking this seriously, that they're now introducing some innovative tests. So they're reducing the tackle height, for example, I think from this season. So they're going to have some imaginary line below the armpits and you can't go above that. They're even going to trial reducing the tackle line to the waist height as well. So I think they're taking it seriously, but it takes some of these very sad stories to come out. I mean, can you imagine not even remembering the pinnacle of your playing career to bring this to the fore?
Yeah, I mean, that brings us to the point. Partly, for example, if we just sort of think about the sports-related concussions, are the sporting authorities, are the regulatory authorities actually doing enough to protect sports people, and what should we be doing? And of course, if one avoids contact, then you're less likely to get a concussion anyway. So Claire, I mean, do you want to, because you must be gaining sort of information from the FA, because I know that they're very much into supporting grassroots football. I mean, what instructions are they? I mean, rules about heading the ball or?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen as severe cases as those with rugby, but certainly some of the footballers from the 50s and 60s were certainly, they've related their Alzheimer's and their dementia to heading that rock hard football as it was then. It's certainly got softer now, but it doesn't mean that clashing heads is any softer. There is some safeguarding there. There's things that are rolling out at a senior and a professional level, but as I said, it's going to take a while for that to filter down into the grassroots playing game. And I think, unfortunately, we aren't necessarily going to see things rapidly rolled out until there are more cases like William has described.
So Michael, I mean, you as you say, you've got a phase 2 asset that's sort of designed to treat these concussions. What sort of relationships have you had with sort of sports people or sporting organizations?
Well, I can tell you that to me, it's a very difficult area, because a lot of the sports injuries do not come from direct exposure or direct contact with the head. And all the protective gear, the only protective gear you could imagine is something that would protect your head. But deceleration injury, when you crash into someone and your head bounces back and forth like a whiplash injury, as a huge component. So just by the contact nature of it, it's difficult to understand how you could play these sports, and Claire understands this, how you could play these sports to their potential in the way we see them today and not have contact. What are you going to do? Eliminate heading? You're going to eliminate body contact? No checking? No this? It's very difficult to contemplate. So there's some big issues here that I don't think anybody, it's the elephant in the room. Nobody really has a good answer for it. We've had extensive communications with professional football teams here in the United States, and quite honestly, there's very little interest in talking to a therapeutic company. And I think the reason is because if you recognize that there's something that needs therapy and there currently is no therapy, then where does that put you? So there's much more of a focus in professional sports on the protective headgear, on the diagnostic tests, because what the sporting teams would love to have to, I think largely to escape liability, is they'd like a test that says this athlete has it, and then they go through some kind of a period of rest or whatever types of physical therapy they go through. They want a test which says now they don't have it, and so now when they go back to the field to play, we're covered. But of course, those things don't really exist, because even the diagnostic tests, so far the diagnostic tests that I've seen, they really have no relationship to giving any information on what the potential outcome is likely to be, and to assess that outcome to see when a patient is at a variety of stages to go back into to the sport. So I think the sporting world's in a very difficult situation right now. We like to think that if you could determine the kind of dividing line behind injuries that are going to result in the long-term severe consequences and injuries that can be dealt with in the short term and a person can recover from, then you could start to focus on the types of things that you might be able to change in sports. So, my son played college football, and I got in concussion after he graduated, thank God, because when I was sitting in the stands, I was more interested about a catastrophic spinal injury, or, I thought if he blew out his knee, that would be really bad. But if he was kind of knocked senseless and stood up, I was going with my old historical view on that. But I talked to him, I said, Connor, did you ever get a diagnosed concussion? Because I don't remember that. He said, no, I didn't. But every day after practice, I would go in to the locker room, start to, take off my equipment. And I was just kind of out of it. And I take a shower. Maybe after I got done, I got home, I was hungry. Maybe I wasn't, maybe I could study. Maybe I didn't have any interest in studying, but the next day I'm back on the football field. So it's those kinds of, and, so you could do things in practice to be able to limit the types of exposure that you'd see with, that would cause those types of collisions. So there might be some ability to reduce that from a practice control and other things. But still, a lot of these games have a significant amount of contact in them, and it's hard to envision getting around for them. Maybe just a comment on the investor side that we talked about. I think I've been in biotech since 1990, worked across vaccines, cancer vaccines, HIV, worked in pain products, worked across a number of indications. And if you go back through that length of time, it's very clear that investment in biotech just, goes through peaks and valleys, interest. And what you realize is that whatever is the hot area, for whatever reason, tends to garner a lot of interest in the investment community. Investors tend to follow investors. And when investors follow investors, they create successful returns. So, I think a lot today, as we look around, there are several companies, some large pharma companies and some VCs, they're starting to create some very big plays in the neurospace. And I think it was mentioned earlier that neuro had kind of fallen out of favor. Pfizer and other large companies dropped their programs. A lot of that was because of the focus in the past on severe TBI and moderate TBI, where we're, a severe TBI injury, we're talking about people that have large tracts of their white matter in their brain completely severed. They're in comas. They're devastating injuries that have long-term rehabilitation required to recover to some degree of functionality. The injuries we're talking about don't share that. They're not that severe. So I think there's a lot better potential to have successful trial outcomes. But nonetheless, that kind of tainted the industry. So I think as we start to see more and more larger companies and funds start in the neurospace, I think that'll generate some excitement. As I say, investors follow investors, but we're definitely, we've definitely come through a period where it has been challenging to raise money for these, for these types of indications, for sure.
Is it worth just touching on Biogen and their recent drug release for Alzheimer's, because that's been quite contentious from the eyes of an investor, because I think the FDA initially approved it, but now there's been a subsequent investigation into it as to whether it is going to be approved, and that just doesn't really help the environment, I suppose, for us laymen and investors, that there are these continued uncertainties in terms of the treatment area. I don't know if anyone's got any technical expertise on that subject, but from the outside, it just creates uncertainty.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of information's still to come out about how the FDA process was, rolled out. I mean, we've got some information in the press, but I don't think it's everything that we need to understand. I would say, it's particularly unusual to run a phase 3 trial, stop a phase 3 trial, and then do a subset analysis that you can then use for approval. It's just a very, very rare bird. And I think it's fraught with a lot of the questions that have been asked about that are rightfully so. How could that occur from a statistical perspective and everything else? I think that there's tremendous interest in some of these neurologic diseases like Alzheimer's. We don't have effective therapies. And I think there's maybe an idea that, yeah, let's get something approved and get it in and see how it goes. And then we can use that to build off of. And that's not a very satisfying answer from the perspective of what is the efficacy of this drug. And if a patient had to assess, should I take this drug? Should a healthcare system reimburse for this drug? What's that answer? So it's not particularly comforting that might have been part of the decision. But I think there's a lot of information that needs to come out of it. But I agree with you. It's not an area that gives me a lot of comfort in how a drug might be approved. Because we tend to follow the old standby processes of just relying on the data.
I think, Will, that's a topic that's we could probably spend all day talking about. Sort of the lessons to learn, and sort of the challenges and opportunities that it creates for the whole sector. We've got some questions coming in from the audience, so I'd like to sort of get to those. But just before I do that, and while I'm perusing it while you're answering, I mean, we talked about sports-related concussion, but when I was sort of looking at some of the some of the numbers, actually, what's interesting is that that one of the groups that actually suffers most from concussions is, in fact, under 4-year-olds, where it's it's kids, I guess, just falling over and hitting their heads. So I was just sort of wondering, given the fact that that's where there's potentially a lot of demand because of the concussions, because it's in such a young group, does that in itself create sort of challenges for developing treatments?
Well, there are some very, they're interesting, shocking, disturbing types of studies that you can run across out there. Some of the studies, for instance, are 50% of special needs kids have a history of head trauma. 80% of homeless people have a history of head trauma. I mean, you could go on and on with those types of statistics. Again, we have to sort those out from all kinds of other mental illness and other things. But if that's the case, then we could be overlooking, a large impact of even a single concussion in a person's life. I think our trials, we're focused on primarily non-athletes in the trials, because for the reason that I said earlier, our patients are not asking when, after I get in halfway through the trial, can I fall down the stairs again? Whereas an athlete is going to try to, even if they get into a treatment program, I think they'd be very interested in treatment, and certainly a treatment for concussion would be widely used in athletics, as we've talked about. But as a trial participant, they're going to want to get back into the field of play and probably, underrepresent the severity of their symptoms while they have them, because they would get back in. And we know some of that goes on when they take these baseline tests, like impact test in the US, where they take that test to set a baseline for what their scores will be, and then they are compared to if they get the injury. So I think, from our perspective, the standard approach to drug development is going to go forward. We are right now testing our drug in an adult population, 18 to 55. The safety of our product, there's over a 300 patient safety database for other indications, and that database would allow us to go down to age 16. But if we wanted to go below 16, we're going to have to do pediatric studies, which get tricky because obviously you're dealing with a population in which safety is paramount, and there's less known about that population. So we would progress into those populations as we went forward. But I'm pretty sure that those pediatric studies would occur after we had a data set that was either approved or was on the verge of approval before we'd get into those. But I think there's, as I said earlier, some of the studies that have uncovered issues, there's a large unmet medical need that we still do not completely understand the scope of.
All right. So I'm going to sort of jump the questions. So in fact, I've got a specific one for you, Michael. The question is, could Michael say something about the emergence of CTE, and how the emergence of CTE led to a change in rules associated with American football?
Well, the CTE, and I mentioned the Concussion Legacy Foundation. The Concussion Legacy Foundation, based in Boston here, has taken a huge lead in trying to encourage people, one, to decrease the age at which kids start tackle football in the U.S., and then to try to limit some of the contact and practices and other things that could lead to this, to kind of decrease the exposure. I would say concussion and injury and mild traumatic brain injury was definitely highlighted by the athlete population. And I think the movie Concussion and some of the issues that were brought up very early about CTE were so shocking that drove a tremendous amount of the interest. Because again, I still can talk to physicians who will, tell me that, well, what are you bothering with concussion for? Because I'm much more interested in moderate and severe injuries where I spend my time, and especially if you talk to neurosurgeons who are involved with brain trauma quite a bit. So I think the sports is definitely very important in driving interest. It's just that I think we're going to get into the sports through the back door by doing the trials in the non-sporting population, and then developing drugs that will have applications to the sporting population.
I mean, is there any sort of difference between sort of a TBI associated with that sort of sporting activity, and say, for example, if I fall off my bike or I fall down the stairs?
I think that I don't think we know enough about the pathophysiology of the injury to suggest that there is a difference. People can get some very severe outcomes from a single concussion falling down the stairs. One thing you can say about athletes is they're highly conditioned. We know that this injury initially is due to a neurometabolic crisis in the brain. That's a global depolarization event in the brain. The recovery from that's largely based on oxygenation, energy availability, and circulation to the brain. And athletes are able to do that. They're highly conditioned. They're also very, their bodies are from the constant contact that they get depending on their sport. They're very conditioned to absorb those types of hits. So they're kind of trained to be in an environment where they are able to withstand those types of hits a lot better, I think, than the general population. But having said that, I think the same things are going on in their heads. They're just exposed repeatedly, and they have this. No one, I can't think of anyone else outside of sports, maybe some professions, some jobs, but to be constantly exposed to subconcussive hits, none of us really experience that. Maybe military populations experience that, but it's a very unique, the repetitive nature of what they're exposed to is, I think, very unique to sports.
Thought it was kind of interesting. You sort of like, maybe suggesting that, I wasn't quite in sort of full fitness if I fell over. And you wouldn't be wrong. So as a sort of a final question, I'm just going to sort of run around, because we each of the panelists, and just sort of ask them to, I guess, share with us their views on why we should be optimistic about sort of the challenges that we're facing, why that we should be optimistic that we're going to be able to actually meet those challenges, and that for example, the long-term impact of sports-related concussions or other concussions will be manageable in the future. So if we go around again in sort of the alphabetical order, so we start with Eva. You're on mute, Eva. You're still on mute. Yeah.
First and not the last, probably. Fingers crossed. Reasons to be optimistic. I think basically, you know, the increased media coverage, albeit it may be cyclical, and just rising, you know, public education on this issue is going to help massively. And then secondly, equally importantly, I think big pharma getting back into neurodegeneration, even if it's not necessarily concussion just yet, but concussion is closely linked to, you know, CTE, dementias, etc., punch-drunk syndrome. I think that's hugely positive because there's therefore going to be things both in industry and academia driving efforts to improve knowledge of the biology, the biomarkers, the pathology, etc. And the more we know about that, the more of an explosion there'll be. I mean, these things take 20 to 30 years time. We're only just really reaping the benefits of improved knowledge of the genetics and pathologies of cancers. So, you know, CNS could be next.
Hugh.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to Eva. I think around that, that, you know, there will be therapies coming through getting approval for some of the chronic disease states, and many of those will have overlapping, some similar pathways that with the diseases we're discussing today, and so they could then be tested in those populations, you know, once they are proved safe and effective in say AD or PD. I think that's a reason for optimism, but I'm also optimistic that again, as Claire and Eva and others alluded to, if all the different stakeholders come together and in a concerted way work on all the list of issues I listed earlier, I think there is going to be a way forward. It will take some time though, and I think it will need a concerted effort from different groups.
Thanks. Claire?
We're going to keep playing sports. And I think the high profile patient power is really going to keep amplifying the need for diagnostics and for therapies in this area. I think medtech, sports tech is going to be at the forefront of this, primarily because it is faster to market, but therapeutics will have to follow.
Will?
Make sure I'm muted. Yeah, I think there is excitement around. I mean, we've already talked about, particularly in diagnostics, some of the developments that have come through, and you know, the great work that companies like Michael's are producing. And the other side, of course, is that sporting authorities are taking it seriously. And I used the example of what rugby are doing, but we're also seeing it increasingly in football and other areas as well. So there's definitely grounds to be optimistic.
And Michael,
I think the brain and neurology and diseases of the brain is I wouldn't say it's the last frontier, but it's getting close to the last frontier. We are recognizing how little we actually know about, you know, how the circuitry of the brain actually affects all these different things we've talked about. And also say there's strong relationships between what we're doing on the biological side, artificial intelligence, brain mapping. I went to a brain mapping conference in LA, and I was just shocked at what these guys are doing to map out the brain and how they're able to sort out neural pathways that they can start to use for types of digital therapeutics and all kinds of things. And I think that will converge to understand exactly how we start to interface with the biology of the brain to treat diseases and improve conditions. And this is a great one because it's as I said, it's a shock wave that goes through. It's not a structural tearing. It's not something we have to repair or glue back together. It's a phenomenon that's largely invisible by imaging, but it's definitely creating long-term effects with wiring changes and other types of changes.
Yeah, and sort of conversations I've had with industry executives, and in fact, what we've seen with the pharma industry is the fact that they're coming back into neuroscience, and in fact that this decade could be the decade where we see advances in neuroscience the way we saw it in immuno-oncology in the past decade. So plenty of reasons to be optimistic. I'd like to thank you all for your participation in this panel. It's been a very, very interesting discussion. And I'm going to hand back over to Alicia.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. Really interesting. So it was interesting to hear how the panel thought that perhaps sentiment had been impacted amongst investors, but by the sounds of it, there's still some way to go for therapeutics. But clear take-home message, diagnostics, protection are very important for preventing injuries. And we'll keep playing them, so keep playing sports. So yeah, it's a really interesting discussion there. And I'd also like to thank all the attendees as well for your comments and questions. Hope you enjoyed listening in. I will be distributing a recording of the session post-event, so you can also choose to recap the discussion in your own time as well. With that, just to thank everyone again and wish you a good evening or rest of your day. So thanks all and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.